In this episode, we continue our series on Pirkei Avos, unpacking the fundamental hashkafic ideas about the role of work in the life of an Eved Hashem. This series is sponsored in memory of my Omama, Henya Rila Bas Eliezer, whose yahrzeit was this week. Two quick housekeeping notes before we begin. Number one is a reminder that we have a quiet WhatsApp group that is growing very, very nicely. If you enjoy this podcast, I highly recommend getting on the WhatsApp group. There are a number of exciting opportunities that you don't want to miss out on. It has also been beautiful to see the community forming around this podcast, from the in-person share with Usher Weiss to a few job interviews and other business shidduchim that we have set up. All this is available for our online community members, so please make sure to check out the link in the show notes. Housekeeping note number 2. While listening to this episode, you might hear me say something that sounds very, very strange. So I'll just say up front that this conversation was recorded during Mina's Mani. There. Now it won't sound so strange anymore. Anyway, now it's time for this week's episode about the beautiful blend of Torah and Derech Eretz. This is Yaakov Wolff, alongside Tzvi Goldstein, and this is Shark Tank. And for our conversation today, we will be learning the Mishna in the second parak of Avos, Yafet Talmud Torah im Derech Eretz. This is probably the most famous Mishna, which touches on the relationship between our Torah and our professional lives. Tzvi, can you give us an overview of what we're going to do over the next 45 minutes or so?
Yeah, so I'm excited to dive into this one. Obviously, once you hear the phrase Talmud Torah im Derech Eretz, most people's first association is going to be with Rosh Hashanah Hirsch, somebody who made a significant impact on my life and the way I think. So I'm excited to get his opinion. But first, I want to just read the Mishnah and sit on some of the formulations first, go through some of the Rishonim. One of my rim from Yeshiva University, from Michael Rosenzweig, actually just recently did a 5 or 6 part series going through this Mishnah with many of the Rishonim, talking about different points. So we're going to be pulling from some of those ideas as well, and eventually to get to the way Rav Hirsch takes this phrase of Talmud Torah Derech Eretz and sit on that for a little bit. So the Mishnah opens, Rabban Gamliel b'no shel Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Omer, Yafet Talmud Torah im Derech Eretz, she'egias shnehem mishakachas avon. Rabban Gamliel, the son of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, says, Talmud Torah im Derech Eretz, together with Derech Eretz, is Yafet. It's beautiful. Interesting. Last week, we had the phrasing of Ehov Esamalacha, you should love your work. This week, we have Yafet Talmud Torah im Derech Eretz. So there's something beautiful about learning together with Derech Eretz. And interesting to have these sorts of formulations that you wouldn't necessarily have expected in this context. It's interesting to note that it came up already twice. And the Mishnah explains, Sheyigias Shnehem Mishakachas Avon. The Yigia, the exertion of both fields of Talmud Torah and Derech Eretz, something which we still need to define. Mishakachas Avon is going to, let's say, dispel or cause you to forget about the possibility of sin. There are 2 more parts to the Mishnah. Kol Torah she'eni mamalacha sofa betela v'goreres avon. Any Torah which does not have work together with it. So as opposed to the first half, which spoke about Torah with Derech Eretz, this part talks about Torah with work. Any Torah which does not have work accompanying it, sofa betela v'goreres avon, will eventually be canceled and will actually bring sin in its wake. And the third part is Kol ha'amelim imat tzibur yu ha'amelim imam l'shem shemayim. Anybody who's working heavily on behalf of the tzibur should be osek, should be amel l'shem shemayim. Now the Mishnah continues. So we have 3 different parts of the Mishnah, almost talking about using 3 different synonyms almost to describe what we're doing. We have Talmud Torah with Derech Eretz, we have Talmud Torah with Melacha, and then we have the idea of Amelus imat tzibur, which is similar, but more clearly different. We're going to focus mainly on the first part and a little bit on the second part as well. We can leave the third part for a different time. Maybe one point to just start off with is it's interesting to know the author of this Mishnah, Rabban Gamliel b'no shel Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was fabulously wealthy right? In addition to maybe as part of being the leader of the Jewish people, the Gemara in Ksubis talks about how Rebuda Nasi. I think the way it describes it is at all seasons, no matter what was available in the shuk, there was lo yasar mishulchan uklum. He was able to access all fruits, all vegetables, even if it wasn't in season. It says that when Rabbi Yehuda Anasi was dying, he raised his 10 fingers towards Shemayim and declared that Hashem, you know that I never got any personal hana from all of my wealth. These 10 fingers never got any personal hana from all of my wealth. Rabbi Yehuda Anasi was fabulously wealthy. Last week when we spoke about the importance of malacha and the idea, I hope it's on malacha, at least half that presentation was based on the parnasa, the sustenance that malacha is able to provide for you. Presumably Rabbi Yehuda Anasi didn't need that, and his son Rabbi Gamliel also likely did not need that. So presumably Rabbi Gamliel did not, because of that fabulous wealth, didn't need malacha for the sake of the parnasa aspect. But still, he's the one who's telling us, Yafet Talmud Torah im derech eretz. So there are a few ways that this line, this Mishnah, is explained in Chazal. Before we jump into them, Yaakov, do you have any thoughts or any ideas that come to mind just reading the Mishnah at face value?
Yeah, the Mishnah seems to be very clear that Torah and Derech Eretz are two things that go together. And it's interesting that in many places in Chazal, you do seem to find that there seem to be presented as binary options, that you can really have one or the other. For example, the famous Shita of Rosh Bar Yochai, which he seems to say, Adam Zoreh b'shas Zriya, b'chorish b'shas Harisha, Torah matei aleh. So I always read that line, like, 1 second, like, what do you mean? You could go to morning Seder in the morning, go to Shachos, and then go to do your Harisha and your Zriya. But no, he seems to be presenting it as one or the other, and that's obviously a massive sugya that needs to be discussed at length. But there are other sources as well. For example, when the Gemara in Sanhedrin says the Adam Amal Yulad, so the Gemara there and maybe the Midrashim that talk about that pasuk in Mishlei seem to make it out that you could either have a choice. Either you're going to be Amel in Torah, or you're going to be Amel in Parnasa, and also Mishna Perkei Avos, which we will hopefully discuss, called Makabel of all Torah. So there are many sources that seem to indicate that Torah and work are these two options that you have to pick one. But this Mishnah seems to be very, very clear and very, very obvious that Torah and Malacha go together, and that's like a very interesting conversation that I'm looking forward to unpacking a little more.
Yes, you brought up the Gemara in Brachos. It's interesting to note that the phrase Derech Eretz is actually used there as well by Rabbi Yishmael. Gemara says, Tanar Rabbanan v'yasafta degenecha, matam lomar, l'fish namar lo yomosh sefer Torah zemipicha, yachol dvarim kichsavan, tam lomar v'yasafta degenecha, hanheg behen minag Derech Eretz, divrei Rabbi Yishmael. So as much as the phrase Derech Eretz can have multiple meanings, something we're going to talk about soon, this Gemara in Brachos Lamed Hey is going to be one of those Marmakomos in Chazal, which give us some definition or give us some insight as to what Derech Eretz could mean. Another Gemara that uses the phrase Derech Eretz in a similar context is a little bit earlier in Brachos Lamed Beis of Beis. Taner Rabbanan Arba Tzrich Nechizuk. There are four areas that need continued strengthening or encouragement. Ve'eluhein, Torah, Masim Tovim, Tefillah, U'Derech Eretz. The Gemara asks the source that Derech Eretz needs chizek. She'amar chazak needs chazak ba'adamenu. When Yoav and Avishai are going out to war, they encourage each other. Chazak needs chazek ba'adamenu. We should be extra strong, right? We give ourselves extra koach when going out to war. Rashi on the phrase trich chizek, he says, "She's chazik adam ben tabin b'chol kocho." A person should encourage himself to use all of his koach when he's involved in what the Gemara calls Derech Eretz. Rashi adds, "What is this Derech Eretz? Im umanhu leumanuso, im socherhu lischoraso, im ish milchamahu lemilchamto." So it's actually a very broad range of activities that fall under this umbrella of Derech Eretz. If he's a tradesman, then to his trade. If he's a merchant, to his involvement with his merchandise, to his selling. And if he's an ish milchama, if he's a soldier, then milchamto, he should be osik b'chol kocho in his milchama. So a very, very broad kind of understanding of what we mean by Derech Eretz. One of the main discussions within the Rishonim in this Mishnah is what exactly do we mean by Yafet Talmud Torah im Derech Eretz? What Derech Eretz are we talking about? So let's jump into the first group. Most Rishonim seem to understand Derech Eretz as a reference to Malacha, to Parnasa, basically making it more or less parallel to the second line in the Mishnah. Yafat HaMatorim Derech Eretz, She'egia Shnei Mishkachas Avon, Kol Torah She'edi Mamalacha, Sofa B'Tela V'Goreres Avon. To take one of those examples, the Bartanura says Derech Eretz means Malacha U'Schora, and explains She'egia Shnei Mishkachas Avon, Sha'Torah Mateshes Kocho Shel Adam. When a person is learning, it takes away a person's koach. And it's another Gemara in Brachos, the Talmidei Chachamim often get sick because of the Torah's mateshes kochan. V'hamalacha mifareches u'mishaberes es hagof. A person's malacha breaks down and makes the body weaker. U'mitoch kach yetzer hara batel mimenu. Through the combined efforts of exertion of Torah and malacha, you're going to be left without energy. You're going to be left without without the energy needed to get involved in sin, to listen to the Yetzer Hara. So it's the act of doing the malacha together with Torah. It's the exertion involved in both learning and malacha that's going to stop you from getting involved in sin, because you're not going to have the energy for it. So one take on the importance of Yafat HaMatorim Derech Eretz is just very practically, you won't be left with the energy to sin after this combination of learning and work.
That's very interesting. Do the Mefarshim talk about the calculus when it comes to losing koach? Because I would think that if you're losing strength because of your work, you're also not learning as well. If a person is so tired from all of their work, and then they come home and try to keep their eyes open for a shir, for a daf yomi at night. So on the one hand, they might have smashed the Yetzer Hara, but they may have also smashed their ability to learn well as well. Do the Mefarshim talk about that?
So I don't remember seeing that discussed by the Rishonim. I think the question you could ask, at least according to this approach, is why do I need malacha if Torah is mateshes kochi? So then let me just do a deep dive into the Torah, and that'll get rid of my koach, and I don't need the hateshes koach provided by the malacha. That I think is discussed, and we're going to use the second phrase of the Mishnah to talk about that part. But specifically about the calculus, I think each person kind of needs to know at what point am I able to continue learning? At what point is my malacha taking away the koach that would otherwise be used by the Yetzer Hara, and at what point is it actually taking away from my Talmud Torah time, and figuring out that balance to avoid losing out in that way.
Right, and it also sort of goes back to what we were saying in our last conversation about Ahovas HaMalacha, that if you love your work enough, then it could also come at the expense of other things. And that's also a discussion episode that we had with Michael Eisenberg, who talked about this topic as well. It's also interesting to think about how these things can play off and influence each other within the broader framework of our life.
Right. So this is one take on the importance of Yafat HaMatorah in Derech Eretz, that it's the actual involvement in those things. So like we said, one thing you could ask is, why do I need the malacha? It isn't just, if Torah is mateshes kocho also, so why don't I just do the deep dive into learning, and I don't need the second half? So some of the Rishonim point to the second line of the Mishnah to explain that. The Kol Torah Sheni Mamalacha Sofa B'Tela V'Goreres Avon. V'Giyasa Tehei Meshakachas Avon. If a person asks, why don't I just do the Amelus B'Torah only, and I don't need, that's why we need the second phrase. If a person doesn't have a source of parnasa, a person doesn't have a way of making money, so then he's going to end up stealing. He's gonna end up having to leave Torah and get involved in some way of making money, whether that's collecting door to door or actually stealing and actually bringing on sin itself. Either way, if you don't set up some source of parnasa for yourself, so you're not going to be able to learn long term, that's going to lead to problems. It's actually going to downgrade your Talmud Torah. I actually heard Rameir Tversky make the point that sometimes a person can feel that he should be learning more Torah, and that's actually the advice of the Yetzer Hara and not the Yetzer Hatov. The example that he gave is, if a person is, let's say, in university, let's say yeshiva university context, where he's learning in the morning and night and going to classes in the afternoon, working on his degree, so the Yetzer Hara can tell him, then you should be maximizing every single possible moment for learning, do the bare minimum for your degree. You'll graduate with whatever GPA that you have, and you'll get your diploma, but you don't need to really invest yourself in doing well or developing any sort of work experience. You don't need to do that. You should be fully in the base medrash. So what you'll have done is you'll have maximized your learning for those 3 years, those 4 years, whatever it is. Then he says, for the next 30 years, when you're actually working on your career, think about the two jobs that you could have gotten. with your let's say less impressive resume, with your lower grades, you're going to get a job with a lower salary, and you're not going to have nearly as many options when you're applying to jobs, and you're going to feel forced into a job which doesn't give you as many opportunities for learning. It's going to be longer hours for lower salaries, and you won't have as many opportunities for learning long term. As opposed to if you had taken a little bit more time during those 3-4 years working on your degree to be able to, let's say, get higher grades and build up some work experience and position yourself in a much better way for applying to jobs, then you can find yourself with a higher salary job, with less hours, with more flexibility, and you could theoretically set yourself up with a morning seder, set yourself up with a kavod night seder, giving shiurim. You can facilitate for the next 30 years of your life much, much more Talmud Torah with the investment of a little bit more time in the 3-4 years of working on the degree. So a person needs to kind of think long term. And I think part of what we're saying here, don't just say I'm going to do Torah only for the next few years, and I'm not going to have any thoughts as to where my parnasa is going to come from, because eventually you are going to need parnasa. You're going to need something to put food on the table. The more you can think and plan, how am I setting myself up for success now with, let's say, an initial investment at this point now that can have a compounding result, or what's the phrase? The compounding returns down the line when you're, in terms of actually balancing in a much more healthy or much more beneficial way, you're learning with your parnasa.
It's a great point. My Rebbe Rav Stav likes to quote the tefillah that we say every evening in Marev, Vaser Satan milfanenu me'acharenu. We ask the Satan not to stand in front of us and block us from doing certain things, but we also ask the Satan not to get behind us and start pushing us in certain directions, because sometimes the Yetzer Hara is there to prevent us. Sometimes the Yetzer Hara is there to push us to do certain things which we might think is good for us, but actually is not good for us. I think it's a very profound point. I think when it comes to practically making decisions based on that, it actually is really, really hard, because the options are so many and there's so much gray area, and it's so hard to really apply that. You know, Rav Torsi gave a bit of a simple, oversimplified example, which I appreciate. I think in real life, it's really, really hard. There's also obviously this slippery slope aspect of like how much hustle and how much ishtadlus and how much am I going to, al tomar liksha efna eshnes, that also comes in. So it can be a really, really hard thing to actually do in practice, but I think the general idea is well taken and is an important one that we have to be having in mind, not just the here and now and not just the very limited scope of what might be more Toradic in the moment, but also the broader scope of things.
Right. Just to highlight one of the conversations that you've had earlier in the series, I think it was Rabbi Chesky Glad, was the point that he made. It's not something that he was thinking about in university, and something which he came back to over subsequent years. He was thinking, as much as he was fully involved in learning for a number of years, he was always thinking, what's my backup plan? When I'm going to need this, how am I positioning myself to be able to be in front of my family in a way which facilitates not just putting food on the table, but also allows me to have that flexibility in continuing to learn and continuing to teach.
And just to throw one more point, which is really beyond our scope today, but I think it's worth unpacking more in a further conversation, is the financial aspect of how much financial backup a person should have and should have in his bank account, and how much work would be justified through that. It's a slightly different conversation.
Thank you for bringing that in. The number of the Rishonim kind of take this approach, either talking about the Torah and Malacha together are mateshes kocho shaladam, take away the strength that would otherwise be squandered and wasted on sin, and on the other hand, Malacha, the importance of Malacha as facilitating a person's parnasas, that he doesn't have to go out and be molasting sabrios like the Gemara in Kedushin that we quoted last week. There are a couple of other nuances that are added. For example, the Magen Avos talks about two ways the Torah is mashkachas avos. First is, like we said, it's mateshes kocho shel adam. It takes away a person's energy that would otherwise be used for sin. But otherwise, and this is really interesting, he writes that learning Torah means you're constantly reminding yourself of isurim. And through that constant asika b'Torah and having these isurim top of mind, that's going to help you avoid mashkachas avon. It's going to help you avoid coming to sin. There is a program out there called Da'ehu, where they send out a daily business halacha email with different issues that could come up in a business context. The more a person keeps those issues top of mind, the more likely he is to be able to plan for and practically avoid those issues in the moment. That's the Magen Avos' take on the Talmud Torah's ability to be Mishkachas Avon is just because the more you learn, the more you're aware of in terms of halacha, and the more likely you are to avoid potentially Yisurim. One more point, let's say within this bucket of Rishon, we talk about who have this approach to the first phrase of that Mishnah, is talk a little bit about the Rambam. When the Rambam talks about the combining of Torah with Malacha, his point is the point that he makes is less about avoiding sin generally and more avoiding a very specific sin, and that the sin of Bizayon HaTorah. In Hilchos Talmud Torah, Gimel Yod, also there's various Avos, more, and I think on Dalet Hey, he talks about this. The Rambam is very insistent, very, very sharp about this point. Says that it's a Chil Hashem, it's a Bizayon HaTorah for a person to take money on behalf of his learning. The idea that he seems to be saying is that it compromises the integrity of the Torah that he's learning, especially the Torah that he's teaching, if he's getting paid by the community, or if he's relying on the community to be able to learn, to be able to teach in that way. The only way that a person can really, let's say, guarantee that the Torah that he's teaching is unblemished or is unaffected by these extraneous concerns is if he has some source of parnasa that he doesn't have to kind of worry about in the back of his mind, always questioning, if I say the wrong thing, are they going to kick me out of the community? Or this is something which they talk a lot about with pulpit rabbis, right? How much leeway does a pulpit rabbi have to actually lead his congregation, or to, let's say, give musar to his shul? Because in the back of his mind, there's always that board of directors, often the board of directors who are making decisions. Do we want to keep the rabbi on, or is he no longer fit with our community and we need to find somebody else? That severely hampers or severely limits their ability to really express themselves the way they otherwise would have. A good Rav knows how to work with his community. A good Rav knows how to kind of balance and take slow steps to bring a community in the direction that he feels is appropriate. But that is attention. That does create some sort of stress there. I think the Rambam's take on this Mishnah, or part of the Rambam's take on this Mishnah, is we want to make sure, but by combining Torah with Derech Eretz, with the source of Parnasa, you're able to ensure that the Torah that you're giving over is free of any of these kind of external concerns, and you're actually giving over Torah the way it's meant to be presented. That's just a little bit of a more specific take on what is the avon that you're being mishakachas.
Yeah, I think that's a really important idea. And I think that the framework of saying, well, Torah is really the main thing and the most important thing, but work has an important supporting role in that framework is a very important one. And just to reference back the mission that we spoke about last time, Avos HaMalacha, so if listeners want to go check it out, the Sforno and the Maharal both have interesting pirushim which really click into that in different ways, different directions. They both say that the reason why you're supposed to love your work is because it's able to be a supporting role in the life, the Torah life, which is a life of Avos Hashem and creating Avos Hashem with others. So that's how the Maharal specifically talks about Avos HaMalacha in the context of Avos Hashem, and the Talmid Chacham was able to be financially independent. So listeners can go check that out, and it really ties back in.
Okay, awesome. So this is really that first bucket of Rishonim, explaining this Mishnah. The Bartanura we quoted, I think Rashi goes this way as well, Rabbi Yonah goes this way as well, Moed Avos, the Rambam has a little bit of a nuance here. They're all kind of taking Talmud Torah Derech Eretz. It's the Mateshes Koch Shladam and the Zik Torah. The providing parnasa is how it's Mishkachas Avon. There's another approach taken by a couple of Mefarshim that understand this differently. Let's say the Meiri, the Yachin, both recognize that Derech Eretz might mean not Malacha or Parnasa, but rather Midos Umusar. Now, the Yachin says, Yafet HaMatar and Derech Eretz, Ratzal Omar, Limud HaTorah Hu Yafet, Rak Kishayish Imam Musar Va'anava. Right, you have to not only develop your learning, you also have to become an ethical human being. This is it's an important point. It's definitely an important point, and obviously it works together. They're not mutually exclusive, but it's less what we're focusing on in this conversation. But it's important to recognize there are some Mefarshim who understand this mission is not really relevant to our conversation, our context, and think it's more talking about Musar and Midos. Important, but not our focus right now. So then there are kind of two more groups to talk about. And they kind of, I think, just want to address them together because and to a certain extent, they kind of go head to head. One of them is mainly going to be exemplified by Rav Hirsch. I think the Maharal might have an idea which sounds like this as well. The other side, let's say, is going to be the Nefesh HaChaim and maybe the Chida as well. Now, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, this is famous, this is well known, but it's important to kind of unpack it. Shimshon Raphael Hirsch talks about, it eventually ends up taking this line, is almost his catchphrase for a significant part of his hashkafa, his worldview. He writes in his commentary to Pirkei Avos, which he actually wrote as part of his commentary to the Siddur. So he writes, the term derech eretz includes all the situations arising from and dependent upon the circumstances that the earth is the place where the individual must live, fulfill his destiny, and dwell together with others, and that he must utilize resources and conditions provided on earth in order to live and to accomplish his purpose. So derech eretz, the importance of derech eretz is a recognition that HaKadosh Baruch Hu placed us here in Olam Hazeh and wants us to accomplish our purpose by making use of our time here in Olam Hazeh. So when you combine Torah with derech eretz, when you allow Torah to guide your steps through this world, that's the idea of Yafa, and that's what we're really meant to be focusing on while we're going through life. How can we synthesize Torah with derech eretz? How can we synthesize the divine blueprint for guidance through this world in order to maximize our time here, but also to accomplish what we're meant to accomplish? If you look at other places within Rav Hirsch's writings, he expands on these ideas, I think, in important ways. Maybe we could just take a few minutes to survey that a little bit. So I want to group together really Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch and Rav Soloveitchik, as much as they do have differences. There are nuanced differences between them. For the purposes of this specific topic, I think they're more or less parallel. Both make significant use of a group of midrashim. The idea that Nisave LaKadosh Baruch Hu Dira B'Tachtonim, Medrash in Bereshis, Rabbi, I think in Mufas, and a bunch of other places. The basic idea is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, at the time of when Hashem created the world, Hashem desired a Dira B'Tachtonim. Hashem wanted a place that he could live down here in this world. This is actually how Hashem created the world in the first place. When Hashem created Adam and Chava, seems like he already had that. That was part of creating this Dira B'Tachtonim in Gan Eden. And after Adam and Chava sinned, they ate from the Eitz Hadas, the Torah says that the Kol Elokim was mitalech bagan. Medrash comments that was the sound of Hashem retreating from and leaving this world behind. He went one step away from this world, one rakia away from this world. Over the course of the next bunch of years, you have the sins of Cain and Hevel, you have the Dor HaFlaga, you have the Nephilim, you have Dor HaMabul. You have a number of sins that keep pushing Hashem farther and farther away until he gets to Sefer Rakiyas from this world. At which point, depending on which text of the Medrash you're looking at, either Avram came along or Hashem decided he wanted to return to the world, and therefore Hashem brought Avram along, facilitated Avram coming around, and Avram brought Hashem one step back into the world. Then Yitzchak brought another. Yaakov, Levi, think we have Kas and Amram, till we finally get to Moshe. We have these 7 steps of Hashem returning to the world. The Medrash says that marks Hashem's return to the Dira B'Tachtonim. So it's almost like this grand narrative stretching from Adam and Gan Eden all the way to Kabbalas Torah on Har Sinai of Hashem wants to be involved with us. He wants to be able to dwell with us in this world. When we sin, when we don't listen to him, when we don't follow his instruction, then he's pushed out of this world. And the benefit of the value of Torah, of Kabbalas Torah, is that it gives us the framework that we need in order to facilitate, to create this Dira B'Tachtonim, that we can only actually do this, make this world a place which can host HaKadosh Baruch Hu when we have the Torah as guidance. And what's, I think, most beautiful, I think one of the Midrashim make this connection explicitly, is that immediately after Kabbalas Torah, right, we have Yisro, we have Mishpatim, where we have the Dinim, which are given by the Torah right following those parshios. We have Trua Tetzaveh, Yaakov Kudei, then we have the building of the Mishkan. So that once we have the Torah, we can now get involved in this project of building a model which is going to host the HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Obviously, it's not actually literally hosting a Kadosh Baruch Hu, and this is b'shachanti b'sochal. Definitely the way Rav Hirsch takes the Mishkan, it's every element is some symbolism, explaining, teaching us something we're supposed to internalize about our own avodas Hashem and our own way of thinking. But we receive the Torah and Har Sinai that gives us the blueprint and the guidance that we need in order to make this world into a place which can actually host the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And then we get into this project of building a symbolic tira b'tachtonim, the Mishkan, which is meant to be expanded in the broadest way to encompass really the entire world. So this is a framework that Rav Hirsch talks about in his commentary to Bereshis. This is something that the Rav talks about throughout Halachic Man. He makes reference to it, I think, as well in Lonely Man of Faith. This is, I think, a really crucial idea. It's one of the most fundamental ideas that you can explore just about a person's purpose in this world. Do we exist for Olam Hazeh, or do we exist for Olam Haba? The Rav and Rav Hirsch come down very, very strongly on the side of Olam Hazeh. Just to be clear, we're not talking about Tanuge Olam Hazeh. We're not talking about meat boards and luxurious vacations. We're talking about working. We're talking about exerting yourself. We're talking about listening to the divine command and doing what we can to bring this world into mold this world into a place which conforms to Hashem's expectations, so that He can come down here and exist with us down here.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there. I think the one thing I wanted to point out and ask what you think about this is that we talk a lot of this podcast in different contexts about the relationship between our years in yeshiva and the years after yeshiva. And I have a theory sort of percolating in my head, which says that a lot of the things that, at least for me, some of the ideas that I got in yeshiva that I really struggled with actually come from the very first few prakim of Mesilas Yesharim, which is a very basic sefer. And a lot of people start the first couple of prakim, and they usually don't make it towards the later prakim for various reasons, because it's long and because those prakim are for more advanced. But if you look in those first prakim, you very clearly don't get the sense that you just mentioned. You very clearly get the very basic framework from Parak Aleph and for the Akdama, is that we're really only here to be spiritual and therefore get our reward in Olam Haba. And that, I think, in many ways feeds into this, call it yeshiva ideology, which says that work is some sort of b'diavad, and leaving the yeshiva to go work is some sort of leaving into the mabul, as we've discussed on this podcast in the past. So I think that is an interesting thing to think about, especially because if you get to the end of Mr. Sharm, he does incorporate the other side of things where he talks more about our responsibility towards the world and our work and stuff like that. So he does get to it, but in yeshiva, we usually don't get to those parts. We usually get to the first parts. And it's an interesting thing. So even the Mesilas Yesharim itself has both and sort of balances both, or says that both are true on a certain level. So I think that's something very interesting and worth unpacking when it comes to specifically the ideology that some of us get in yeshiva and how that translates to the life afterwards.
Yeah, so I think the Mesilas Yesharim is a perfect example. At least the beginning of the Mesilas Yesharim is a perfect example of that other mentality. I mean, I think another presentation of parallel, not the same, but a parallel presentation, also I think which fits very well with what you said about the yeshiva world mentality is the Nefesh HaChaim. Now, the Nefesh HaChaim is very often quoted as the let's say the patron saint. I'm going to say that of the Torah only world. Especially Shar Dalet of Nefesh HaChaim, where he talks about the unbelievable impact of Talmud Torah for keeping the world going. He famously says that if there would be a moment with no Torah being learned across the entire world, then the world would return to tohu vavohu. And they say because of that, he actually set up 24-hour mishmaros in the yeshiva of Leshen to make sure that there was. He took responsibility. He and his students took responsibility for making sure that the world would always continue to exist. But if you look at that idea in context, if you don't just start at Shar Dalet, you actually start at Shar Aleph, start at the beginning of the Sefer, it actually fits very nicely into the broader idea that Nefesh HaChaim writes in the Sefer itself. The idea that he explains is that a Kadosh Baruch Hu created people in order to, let's say, in a certain sense, actually be mitakein the olam. In that sense, there is a parallel with, let's say, the Rav and Rav Hirsch. But the olam that he's talking about is not olam hazeh. The olam that he's talking about is the olamos ha'elyonim. It is the upper worlds, the Atzilus, Bria, Yitzira, and Asiyah, for those who have a little bit of familiarity with the world of Kabbalah. He says that a person's actions, especially his mitzvos and averos, have these far-reaching impacts in the upper worlds. It brings down light and kedusha which those worlds need in order to achieve their full tikkun. Every mitzvah is mosif or kedusha, and every aveira takes away or adds darkness to those worlds. And Talmud Torah is unique within that framework, within that understanding, because it reaches back to the source of all those worlds. Torah, Raisa, Kachbrichu Chadhu, Torah and Akash Baruch Hu are one, and therefore it's not only impacting elements of those those upper worlds, but it's actually reaching all the way back to the source of those worlds, Akash Baruch Hu himself, and making some sort of a tikkun or being mosivor at the very source, which has this outsized impact as it spreads throughout all of the worlds. So the Nefesh HaChaim's perspective is, yes, we're meant to be mitaken. He's not saying the same as the Mesilas Yesharim, saying we're meant to be focused on tanog and hana'ah of Olam Haba. There is a sense of responsibility for the world, but it's not talking about Olam Hazeh, and it's not talking about finding a malacha, finding a job that you can exert yourself for Litovas at Tzibor and find some way of using your talents, using your interests in order to contribute in a positive way to building a society which can play host to the divine presence. Rather, it's fully invested in, let's say, narrow Torah and mitzvos. Do as much learning as you possibly can, because that has the strongest, most significant impact on the Olamos Elyonim. And then, almost like tier 2, is to do mitzvos as well, because of the cosmic or metaphysical impact that those mitzvos have on being mitaken, not the Olam Hazeh, but the Olamos, or the Olamos Elyonim. So these two perspectives of the Mesilas Yesharim and Nefesh HaChaim, as much as they are different, they're parallel in the sense that when a person is asking himself, how should I be spending my time, right? How should I, at least in theory or in an ideal world, spend as much of my time as possible? Both the Ramchal, let's say at the beginning of Mesilas Yesharim, and Nefesh HaChaim will tell you, try to minimize as much as possible your asik of the malacha, your asik and anything else aside from Torah. When you have mitzvahs to do, obviously do those mitzvahs. As opposed to somebody like the Rav and Rav Hirsch, they would be much more open for you to, let's say, like we said from the Chos al Avos, it would be important for you to recognize what are the interests, what are the skills, what are the talents that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gifted me when I was born, and how am I meant to use those for the mitzvah? Again, Chos al Avos is Lashon, for the mitzvah of La'avda U'Lishamra, for the importance of being Osek B'Yishuv Shalom, Lashon HaMedrash, to create that dira.
Right, and even though there are so many sources that seem to indicate what Rav Hirsch and Rav Soloveitchik are saying, I think those in the Nefesh HaChaim world, what they will say is, ideally, yes, if you are able to make that synthesis, that would really be amazing. You can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but they quote this idea of Yeridas Hadoros, and they say that maybe in previous generations, people are great enough that they could be spiritual, but also affect the physical as well and build Beis HaMikdash. But nowadays, we really don't have that capacity, and therefore, we have to focus on Torah only. And that's how it explains the dynamic, which I explained before, that the Mesilas Yesharim in his later prakim does talk about this idea, but the Mesilas Yesharim was written in the ascending order of Rav Pinchas ben Yair. So if you're really great enough and you really get all the way up that ladder, then you can come back and bring the Torah into the practical world and into the actual world and build a Mikdash with your world. But Hamon Am, we don't have that capacity nowadays.
I'm not sure how much they would kind of even give that much recognition of the inherent value. I haven't necessarily heard that in other places. Even for, let's say, the Mesilas Yesharim is not presenting his take there as the first step on the ladder. It's almost like he's, before you've started ascending the ladder, he's very explicit that what he wants to do before starting the Sefer is to lay out what is a person's ultimate goal. It's actually it's really amazing how clear he is about the importance of setting out that ultimate goal before you even start the process. Because like how can you accomplish anything without clarity as to what you're trying to accomplish? So he reiterates, I think, 3 times in that first parak. What am I saying? I'm saying that a person needs to prioritize Olam Haba, or keep his focus on Olam Haba, and see Olam Hazeh as only the Hechidimsa in order to get into Olam Haba. And even in the other places in the Sefer, later on in the Sefer, where he seems to recognize the importance of developing this world and creating that Dir B'Tachtonim, let's say that sort of model, he never retracts and he never modifies what he said in that opening parak. And again, he didn't present it as the first step in the ladder, which can then be modified by later steps. He was presenting it as the ultimate goal, which is then going to be accomplished through the steps of the ladder that he's going to lay out. So I think there's more work to be done to understand what the Mesilas Yesharim is saying. Others have definitely argued with me on that. But okay, let's say Oshaz on the way specifically for that question. But especially when it comes to Nefesh Chaim, I'm not sure that Nefesh Chaim would say that in the past it was more ideal to be Mishalev and try to find some way to synthesize your focus on the physical and the spiritual. And only now, the point is we're at such a low level that we need to be involved only in the spiritual. It seems like he's presenting a cohesive worldview, which focuses more or less entirely, as much as possible, on the spiritual. But it's going to be interesting to see the Nefesh Chaim's take on this Mishnah, because this is an example of a source which is going to push the Nefesh Chaim, let's say people in the Nefesh Chaim camp, in order to explain what do we do with Maramakum, which seems to lean more towards the Rishon Shemufal Hirsch or Soloveitchik camp, as opposed to more naturally to the Nefesh Chaim side. So we have Rav Hirsch's take on this Mishnah, the idea that Torah is meant to Yafet Talmud Torah im derech eretz. Torah is the guide which allows us to navigate Olam Hazeh and accomplish our purpose here in Olam Hazeh by building a society, a derech eretz, which fits God's blueprint for that world. The other side, the Nefesh Chaim, obviously needs to deal with this. So the Nefesh Chaim, the Nefesh Chaim and Ruach Chaim, his commentary to Avos, explains like Rava in that Gemara in Brachos that we quoted. Rava, after the Machlokes with Rabbi Yishmael and Rishon Bar Yochai, the Gemara tells us that Rava told his Talmidim, don't come to Shir for a few months in order to facilitate learning the rest of the year. And he adds, so it's very much kind of limited to do as little as possible, only for a couple of months, 2 months out of 10, 2 months out of 12, do some work so you can work for the other, you can learn for the other 10. But he adds that chas v'shalom, to say that you're not going to be learning during that period of time, during the time that you're working. Instead, you should be involved in learning even while you're working. Nefesh Chaim, in the Sefer Nefesh Chaim also, he basically makes the same point within the Shita of Rabbi Yishmael. Right? Rishon Bar Yochai more or less sounds like what the Nefesh Chaim is saying. Rabbi Yishmael, who says that there is some value to be involved in work, Nefesh Chaim says, don't think that you're going to be disconnected from learning while you're working, according to Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael assumed that you're going to be chazering the sugya, you're going to be saying over Mishnayos Baal Peh while you're doing your malacha, and that's what it means, Yafet Talmud Torah, im derech eretz. That im is saying that while you're involved in your malacha and your derech eretz, of course you need to be learning then as well. Right, so he takes this Torah-only mentality and says, even the sources which are clearly telling you should be involved in something other than learning, no, they're not actually saying that. Because even while you're osik in those things, make sure Torah is going on in your head as well. So the Nefesh Chaim says is foiled to Rishon Shemufal Hirsch in terms of Soloveitchik, whereas Rav Hirsch and the Rav take the Torah in Derech Eretz as saying that you have your Talmud Torah, and you should take the values, take the guidance of Talmud Torah into your derech eretz, into your parnasa. Nefesh Chaim says you never have the right to stop learning for a moment. Torah is the only thing that matters. Torah is the only priority. And yes, there are needs to put food on the table, to be mefarnes your family, but you also need to be learning at that time as well.
So just yesterday, I went for the very first time to volunteer helping pick lettuce near Otef Aza, and the whole Karen Biavna call went. It was very nice. It was very special. And like after 2 or 3 hours, and you get a little bored of just like picking lettuce. And there were these 3 or 4 Thai workers that were there, and the guys were saying like, well, can you imagine just like doing that all day, every day, just picking more lettuce and picking more lettuce and picking more lettuce? And I said, what are you guys crazy? Can you imagine if you just like could like listen to Shiurim and like you could finish Shas monthly if you had all day just to pick lettuce with your AirPods on and listening to Shiurim? So that would be the Nefesh Chaim's approach to being a farmhand.
Absolutely. Nice one. Very, very good. I think just about that Gemara, about that point, do you ever have the, let's say, the right to disconnect yourself from learning? So it's actually a point that I think Rav Rosenzweig has made. The Gemara, there's a famous Gemara, which really Tosfos, really a number of the Rishonim asked about when you make a birchas Torah at the beginning of the day, you're and then you're mafsik throughout the day, and then you come back to learning later. So we know that you don't have to make another birchas Torah. The question is, why not? Right? There's a famous Tosfos, a number of Rishonim talk about this. So the way Rav Rosenzweig presents the Rush's answer to this question is that as much as you may not be learning Torah in a concrete sense with a sefer in front of you throughout your day, You're meant to be living your life, going through whatever scenario life throws at you with the guidance gained from sugyas, the guidance gained from halacha, the guidance gained from your Talmud Torah, which is meant to be guiding you and helping you navigate those situations. So it's less safer Talmud Torah, but it's much more, let's say, mentality Talmud Torah. And I'm not talking about reviewing Mishnayos, mental Talmud Torah. I'm talking about this to a certain extent almost subconscious, but it doesn't have to be, level of Talmud Torah where you're living life with the guidance of Talmud Torah, and that's what almost saves your bracha and means you don't have to make a new Birchas Torah. I think that would be the way somebody like Rav Hirsch or the Rav would explain that sugya, that that's how they want you to be living your entire life, guided by the ideas that you're gleaning from your Torah study, as opposed to the Rosh Chaim. He would say, like, what are you talking about? Like the reason, I'm not saying this in a halachic sense, I'm saying the point that you make is like, what do you mean you're mastic from Torah? I don't care what you were doing throughout your day. You're supposed to be practically learning the entire time. Obviously, the question still exists for him. Take a nap, you go to the bathroom. There are times where you're not able to learn, but at least in theory, I think that those are two very different ways of understanding a sugya like that based on these two perspectives. Right, so we took this Mishnah of Yafet HaMatorim Derech Eretz, and we saw that there are 4 different ways that the Mefarshim take this Mishnah. Number one, the majority of the Rishonim certainly understand that it's in a very practical way. Derech Eretz most likely means malacha or parnasa, and two things that malacha provides to avoid sin. Number one, both Torah and malacha are mateshes kocho shel adam. It takes away a person's koach, leaving less energy available, less time and energy available for sin. Number two, having a source of income to allow prevents you from getting involved in things like having to go door-to-door collecting or stealing from the tzibur. Getting involved in unethical business practices in order to make enough money to survive. Having a good job, having a strong parnasa, together with your Talmud Torah means you're not going to end up with sin. That's kind of one bucket within the Rishonim with a few nuances. We also had a couple of Mefarshim who thought that this Mishnah was talking about Derech Eretz in the sense of Musar Umidos, not really relevant to definitely relevant to a Shrakte context, but not directly relevant to the context of Malacha Parnasa and bringing that into our life as B'nai Torah. And then the groups 3 and 4, let's say Rav Shamter Val Hirsch and the Rav or Soloveitchik on the one hand, and the Nefesh Chaim L'chida also on the other hand, asking the question: are we meant to live with an eye towards Olam Hazeh or an eye towards Olam Haba? Rav Hirsch and the Rav saying Torah is what allows us to make this world into a dira b'tachtonim. It's Torah together with Derech Eretz that allows us to accomplish our purpose down here in this world. I think the Rav's beautiful formulation is we're just as religious as religious men, one of the 3 archetypes that he describes in the beginning of Halachic Man, except whereas religious man is trying to escape this world and get up to the upper worlds, Halachic man is firmly planted in this world and is trying to pull HaKadosh Baruch Hu down into this world by building this world, by developing this world into a Torah-formed place. That's the Rav and Rav Hirsch. And Nefesh Chaim on the other side is basically saying that your only focus is meant to be on the Olam Haba element and the Talmud Torah and mitzvos narrowly, and any malacha, any parnasa that you're forced to be involved with should be accompanied by as much asika b'Torah as you possibly can.
Right. One parting thought that I have on this Mishnah is that the verb yafa, which we pointed out at the beginning, is an interesting one. So my Rebbe Rav Lachman likes to quote that every morning after Kriyat Shema we say emes v'yatzi v'nachon v'kayim. The beginning is the emes, the truth, and at the very, very end v'yafa adavar aleinu. And so he says to say that the emes is like the most important thing, and yafa is the complete farthest opposite. So what is this yafa? What is this beauty that we're talking about here in the Mishnah? So I always thought that it might be related to a vort that I actually heard from my grandfather. I believe he was quoting Rav Pam, which says that in Parshas Korach, Rashi says, Parshazu Yafa Nidreshes. There's a beautiful drasha on this pasuk. Well, why is Rashi giving us a beautiful drasha? Who cares about the beautiful drasha? Or we want to have a true understanding of what the Torah means. So what is a Yafa Nidreshes? So I believe what he said was that Yafa, and I believe he has other rayas for this as well, beauty is aesthetics. When you have different things that go well with each other, that's Yafa. So in Parshas Korach, the Midrashim and the Pshat are Yafa. They go well together. They feed off each other in a very beautiful way. So that's Yafa. So I think here also, Yafa Talmud Torah Derech Eretz, I always understood, is that there's beauty in synthesizing and melding different colors and different shades, and in the symphony, as our Chashulchan talks about it, with different sounds coming together. So when they're put together in the proper way, then you have this idea of beauty, yafa. So that would, l'chora, if that's pshat in yafa, Talmud Torah Eretz, seems to fit a lot better with Rav Soloveitchik and Rav Hirsch versus, I don't know, the Nefesh HaChaim and the broad and beautiful and multifaceted worldview that incorporates these different elements of the Beis Medrash and the practical world and putting them all together in the right way. That if my interpretation of yafa is right, it feeds better into that interpretation of the Mishnah.
Yeah, just to continue with that point about Yafa, about the synthesis, as you said this so nicely. Just think about how think about taking that point from the individual level to the communal level, right? Whereas this mission is saying for every individual, it's Yafa to be able to synthesize his learning with his Eretz, but recognize that that's also meant to be taken to the communal level. And there's so many different types of people with so many different types of interest. If they're all committed to this, let's say to the Rosh Hashanah Hirsch, to the Rosh Soloveitchik approach of developing Olam Hazeh, so then you'll have your social workers who are osek, let's say, in the sugyas of social work, and you'll have your doctors who are osek in the sugyas of medicine, medical halacha. You'll have your lawyers who are osek in your sugyas related to law, and you'll have your businessmen and financial professionals, and you'll have they're all the different, let's say, types of parnassas, all the different types of malacha. If they're all committed to this goal of Yafat Talmud Torah Derech Eretz, so what is created is an entire society which is fueled by people who are deeply committed to and deeply invested in the guidance that they're receiving from the Talmud Torah, which is uniquely calibrated for their profession, their asika b'yeshuva shel olam, and the broader picture that's created when everybody comes together is this really incredible, beautiful society, what Chazal often call the Merkava for the Shechina. You're able to do Yafat Talmud Torah in Derech Eretz in your limited sense as it relates to you as an individual. When you blow this up to the communal size, there's something really incredibly powerful that can be created. Think of politics, which were run by politicians who are committed to the guidance of Talmud Torah, their asika b'Torah, guided by Torah, not just Torah halacha, but guided by Torah values. The picture that creates is so inspiring. It can only happen if we have all different types of people, all different types of professionals who are committed to this goal, as opposed to people who are only looking to make a buck, just looking to make the money that they need to make in order to put food on the table. You don't get the same sense of a community coming together and becoming this Merkava l'Shechina, of bringing the Shechina down into this world through this unbelievably inspiring community. You have a lot of individuals who are each doing the things that they need to survive in order to be able to get back to the Beis Medrash. As important as that is, and as valuable as that is on the individual level, for perspective like the Nefesh HaChaim, it misses, or it doesn't seem to contribute to this symphonic type of perspective, especially on the communal level.
Okay, Tzvi, thank you so much, and we look forward to keeping this conversation going and seeing some more Mishnah the next time we talk. Thanks so much for listening. This episode was part of our Thursday Pirkei Avos series. On Mondays, we will be continuing our regular interview series. This coming week, we have our very first conversation with a mental health professional, and it is really fascinating. I can't wait to share it with you. If you enjoy Shark Tank, please make sure to give a 5-star review and make sure that you're subscribed. It really helps us grow the show and reach new listeners. Until next time, keep on steiging, Chevra.